the memories that were not mine. I was never the kind of person who believed in these stories of haunted objects or things like that. But after what happened that day, I can't ignore what I lived. It all started when my friends and I decided to explore the basement of Felipe's grandparents' old house. He was going to sell the house, so we were helping organize what was important and throw away the rest. The basement was full of old boxes, broken furniture, and a lot of things that seemed forgotten for decades. It was there we found the jar. It was large, dark ceramic with some cracks, but what caught our attention were the folded pieces of paper that were inside. They were yellow and looked old, but still could read. We started to open the papers one by one. They were short messages, written by hand. Things like, "I smelled her on our wedding day," or "His laugh still echoes in my mind." They were always very personal memories, but what made us shiver is that almost all mentioned someone who seemed to have died. We did not understand what it was. Felipe thought they were memories of his family's old relatives, but the tone of the messages was so intimate and heavy that it looked different. As if they were not only memories, but feelings captured in a way that almost felt what those people felt. Curious and thinking that it was just something bizarre, but harmless, we decided to play a little. The idea came from Gustavo. Each of us would write an important memory that we had of someone who died and put it in a jar, just to see how it was get into the joke. At first, I refused. I was never a fan of these things, especially involving people who have already left, but the crowd started to joke, saying that I was afraid, and I ended up giving in. I took a piece of paper and wrote about the day my grandmother taught me how to make carrot cake. It was one of the happiest moments I had with her before she died, and just remember smelling the cake coming out of the oven. We fold the papers and put them back in the jar. After that, we laugh a little and continue cleaning. Everything seemed normal until the time I went to bed. That night, I had a very real dream. It was not only real, it was almost like reliving that moment with my grandmother. I was in her kitchen, smelling the cake, hearing her laugh as I dropped flour on the table. But suddenly something started to change. Her face became strange, almost blurry, as if it was not clearer. And then she stopped talking to me. She just stared, with an expression I've never seen in my life. The kitchen looked darker, stuffy, and I felt a huge anguish, as if something was wrong. I woke up sweating cold, with the feeling that it was not just a dream. The next day, I told my friends about the dream while we were still going through the things in the basement. I was surprised when Lays, who is the most skeptical of the group, said that she also had a strange dream. She had written about her father, who died when she was 12 years old, and said that she dreamed of him in a place that looked like the backyard of the house where she grew up. Only that, in the dream, he did not say anything. It was just standing back to her. Every time she tried to call or touch him, he seemed to move away, as if the yard was getting bigger and farther. Gustavo and Felipe said they didn't remember their dreams, but Gustavo commented that he woke up in the middle of the morning feeling like there was someone else in his room. We laughed, a little nervous, but nobody talked about the jar at that time. In the afternoon, while we were waiting for the last boxes, something strange happened. We were almost done when Philip found more pieces of paper inside another box, but these looked much newer. They were written in the same handwriting as the papers on the jar, only the details were absurdly accurate about things that had happened to us, as if someone had watched our lives. One of them mentioned Lay's dream, describing the yard and her father's back. Another spoke about the smell of carrot cake and the feeling of something wrong, just like in my dream. The worst was a paper that had only one sentence: "You did not close the door." That phrase, "you didn't close the door," made everyone uncomfortable. None of us knew what it meant, but the tone seemed a warning. Philip tried to laugh, saying it was a coincidence, but no one bought. We left the papers aside and continued organizing the basement, but I could not get it out of my head. It was then that, without realizing it, I began to feel a kind of pressure in my ears, as if we were in a very high or closed place. I asked if anyone else was feeling that, but only Lay said yes. She became pale and said she needed to get some air. When we came home that night, it got worse. In my room, while I was trying to sleep, I smelled the same carrot cake. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but the smell became stronger, so real that it seemed like someone was baking the cake in my kitchen. I went there to check, but everything was erased and silent. When I returned to the room, I was shocked. The paper that I had put in the jar was folded over my pillow. There was no way that it was there. I knew I had left it in the jar, along with the others, and no one else had access to my room. When we came home that night, it got worse. In my room, while I was trying to sleep, I smelled the same carrot cake. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but the smell became stronger, so real that it seemed like someone was baking the cake in my kitchen. I went there to check, but everything was erased and silent. When I returned to the room, I was shocked. The paper that I had put in the jar was folded over my pillow. There was no way that it was there. I knew I had left it in the jar, along with the others, and no one else had access to my room. I took the paper with trembling hands, trying to understand how it was possible. The worst was to realize that he was not exactly as I had written. The phrase about my grandmother was there, but just below, in a handwriting that wasn't mine, had something new written: "She's not who you remember." I was looking at it for a while, trying to rationalize. Someone was playing with me, could only be. Just the more I looked, felt that same pressure in my ears, and the smell of the cake seemed to change. From something cozy, it became a foul smell, almost rotten. I dropped the paper on the floor and left the room, terrified. In the hallway, I noticed that the house was colder than normal. Everything seemed strangely quiet, but I heard something coming from the room, a low sound, like paper being crumpled. My heart popped. When I approached, I saw that the jar was on the coffee table, even though I had left it in Felipe's car. Around him, the papers we had placed were scattered, and now all were covered with words. They were not messages about memories or feelings as before. They were short, threatening phrases, almost all repeating the same thing. "You left the door open." I froze at the time. What did that mean? Which door? The phrase was hammering in my head as I looked at the scattered papers. I took courage and started collecting them one by one. It was then that I realized that some had no more letters, but marks, as if they were dark spots that looked like fingerprints. They were different from each other, as if they were from several hands. When I touched the jug, I felt something strange, a kind of weak vibration, almost like a pulse, but I decided not to think about it too much. Just wanted that out of my house. I took everything running and went to the house of Felipe to return the jar and papers. When I got there, I knocked on the door with force, and Philip came to open with a strange expression. Before I even explained, he pulled me inside and said something was happening to him too. He showed the phone. He had received a message from an unknown number that said only, "You know what to do." He swore that he didn't tell anyone about the jar or the papers. I was about to tell what happened to me when I noticed something in the corner of his room. The papers from the jar I had brought with me were there, lying on the floor. I knew I had stored everything in the car. There was no way they were already there. Me and Felipe stood still, staring at the papers on the floor. He looked at me, waiting for an explanation, but I had nothing to say. I took courage and approached to check the rolls up close. They were different again. Each of them now had a name written, only that the names were ours. My name, that of Philip, Lays, and Gustavo. Under each name, there was a single phrase. My mother said, "You let in." Philip took his, and when reading it, he became so pale that he seemed to faint. I did not have the courage to ask what was written. He just threw the paper on the floor and went to the kitchen, breathing hard. It was at this moment that we heard the door of the house slam, but no one was near it. I froze at the time. We ran to the room and saw that the door was ajar, swinging slowly as if someone had just passed through it. Philip went straight to close the door, but when he touched the handle, it froze with ice. He pulled his hand back, scared, and muttered something like, "He's not alone." I swear at that instant, the air in the room changed. It got heavier, colder, and we had the feeling that we were no longer alone. It was then that we heard the sound of footsteps coming from the corridor, slow and drawn. The steps got higher, closer, but the corridor was completely empty. The worst was that the sound seemed wrong, as if something very heavy was walking, but without the rhythm of a human walk. Philip looked at me with a mixture of panic and unbelief, and without thinking twice he ran to the jar I had placed on the table and took it. "That's it, that thing," he cried. Before I could stop him, he ran into the yard and threw the pitcher on the ground. The sound was scary, not only because of the impact, but because it sounded louder than it should be, as if something had exploded inside it. Pieces of pottery flew everywhere, and the jar just fell apart. For a moment, everything was silent. Philip looked at me, a little relieved, but then we heard a low and continuous sound, like a whisper coming from all sides. The papers, which were on the floor of the room, began to move by themselves. They floated for a few seconds and suddenly fell all at once. A strong wind passed through the house, slamming doors and windows, but there was no wind outside. After that, everything became absurdly quiet. Even the normal noises, like the sound of the street or the insects in the yard, disappeared. The feeling of something watching us was still there, but the steps stopped. Felipe only managed to murmur, "What if it wasn't to break?" After that last comment from Felipe, I started to feel that there was nothing more we could do. The jar was broken, the papers scattered, and the house looked like a tomb. The silence was so strange that it gave the feeling that something was waiting, but waiting for what? We decided to collect the papers again, even without knowing why. That's when I realized they were all blank. The words, the threats, the names, everything was gone. Only yellow leaves remained, some torn but completely empty. That was supposed to be a relief, but it was even more frightening, as if whatever was playing with us had ended and no longer needed the papers. After collecting everything, I left as fast as I could. When I got in my car, I looked at Felipe's house through the rearview mirror. It was only for a second, but I swear I saw someone standing in the room window watching me. You could not tell who or what it was, but it wasn't Felipe. I wanted to stop, come back and warn you, but something inside me said it was better to keep driving. I came home exhausted, but the smell of carrot cake still seemed to be soaked in me. I checked everything, locks, lights, even looked under the bed, like a child afraid of the dark. The night passed without incident, but the silence was disturbing. The next morning, I sent a message to the group asking how they were. Gustavo replied saying that he had slept well and did not remember anything strange, but Lays did not answer. Felipe also remained silent, which only increased my anxiety. I spent the day trying to forget what had happened, but it was impossible. Everything seemed wrong, even the way people around me acted, as if they were avoiding contact with me. When I finally managed to call Felipe in the late afternoon, He answered with a low voice, almost whispering. "Is everything okay?" I asked, but he answered something that left me cold. I think he did not leave. Before I could ask what he wanted to say, the call went down. I tried calling again, but he didn't answer. Gustavo and Lays also did not reply to the messages that day. I spent the night alone, with the lights of the house all on, trying to rationalize what Felipe said. Who was he? What was still there? About 2 in the morning, I was about to fall asleep when I heard something that made me sit on the bed in a flash. The sound of paper being crumpled, coming from the corridor. The fear took over, but I could not move. I just stood there, listening to that sound once more, repeating as a warning of whatever it was. As much as I wanted to ignore it, the sound didn't stop. It was as if someone was kneading and kneading paper very slowly, with that dry noise that seemed to echo in the silence. Created courage and went to the corridor, with my legs shaking. There, everything seemed normal, but the sound continued, now coming from the guest room, which was empty. I opened the door carefully and turned on the light. In the center of the room, on the floor, was one of the papers from the jar, all crumpled. I took the paper very carefully, and as soon as I touched it, the sound stopped. The room was mortally silent again, and I felt the same cold as I had felt in Felipe's house. When I opened the paper, my heart almost stopped. This time it had a single sentence written, "You opened the door and never closed." I stood there, holding the paper, not knowing what to do. After a few seconds, I heard a strange noise coming from downstairs, as if someone had pushed a chair. I did not have the courage to go down. Stayed in the room locked until dawn. When I finally had the courage to leave, I found all the chairs in the kitchen turned upside down, and in the center of the table, the picture was there, as if it had never been broken. To this day, I don't know how that happened or what we really brought into our lives. The quiet apartment. I was living in an apartment with 3 university colleagues when this happened, in 2017. It was my second year of college, and the rent of that place was so cheap that we didn't even think twice before closing the contract. The apartment wasn't exactly a dream. It had dark spots on the ceiling, doors that creaked, and a strange smell in the hallway that we never found out where it came from. But for us, hard students, it was paradise. I shared the place with Julia, who has been my best friend since high school, and 2 guys, Pedro and Lucas, whom we met in communication course. Everyone got along well, so it seemed perfect. The day we moved, the building manager, a gentleman named Geraldo, came to talk to us. He seemed kind of strange, the kind that looks at you too long without blinking, but we did not give much ball. He handed us the contract and pointed to a specific passage, mandatory quiet time, 23H to 7H. Any violation will be penalized. We thought it was funny because the building looked empty. There was almost no one living there. We played that it was just Geraldo trying to keep control, and we went on with our lives. In the first days, we respected the schedule. Because we were exhausted from classes and work, early sleep was no problem. For a few weeks, everything went smoothly. The routine was quite normal. We shared tasks, studied late, and sometimes watched movies together. But one day, we ended up staying up after 11 o'clock, talking in the room. We were excited because Pedro had gotten an internship, so we started talking loudly, laughing and opening some beers. It was when we first heard a sound coming from the ceiling. It was a dry nose, like someone banging on a wooden cable on the floor above. We thought it was the neighbor complaining and tried to turn down the volume, but suddenly the sound started moving. It was no longer coming from the ceiling. It seemed to be inside the apartment corridor. We were quiet, trying to understand what it was, but in a few seconds, we heard a loud knock on the door of the room. No one had the courage to open. We stood still looking at each other until the noise stopped out of nowhere. Peter went to the eyeglasses, but he didn't see anyone. We tried to laugh at the situation and convinced ourselves that it was Geraldo wanting to teach us a lesson, but the mood had already become heavy. That night, everyone went to bed early. The problem is that it was just the beginning, and things will get much stranger. The next night, even without planning, we ended up getting up after 23 hours again. This time, we were playing cards in the kitchen. At first, everything seemed quiet, but at 11:15 p.m. we heard footsteps in the hallway. The sound was slow, heavy, as if someone was wearing boots. When we looked through the door, the corridor was empty. Pedro, who was the most skeptical, made a joke saying that it was just the old building squeaking, but soon after the lights of the kitchen blinked. It was fast, just a moment, but enough to make us uncomfortable. We finished the game in a hurry, and each went to his room. In the early morning, I woke up with a sound that seemed to come from the foot of my bed. It was a whisper, low, almost like someone trying to say my name. I was paralyzed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I was dreaming. But then I heard the sound of paper being dragged across the floor. I created courage, took my cell phone to light the room, and saw that my chair, which was in the corner, was facing me. I know I didn't leave her like that. It gave me a cold in the spine. I spent the rest of the night with the light on, and the next day, I realized that I was not the only one. Julia and Lucas had also had strange experiences, but no one wanted to admit that they were afraid. After that night, we started to avoid anything that could keep us up after 11 o'clock. But of course, with time, we ended up relaxing. A week later, Pedro decided to order pizza late at night, and we all stayed in the room waiting. When the clock passed 23h, the same pattern began again. Hits on the ceiling, steps in the corridor, and this time something new. A scratched sound, with nails scraping on the door. Julia stood up, indignant, saying that it was Geraldo again. She opened the door, but the corridor was completely empty. Not a sound, no sign of anyone. The strange thing was that when she came back, we found a mark on the wall near the door. It was like a crack, long and deep, that seemed made of something metallic. Nobody could explain how it had appeared. It was at this time that Lucas started to research the building. He found out that years earlier, a fire had been set upstairs. No one had commented on this when we moved, but Lucas found a newspaper article about 2 deaths in the apartment directly above ours. It changed the dynamics completely. The idea that something other than coincidences was happening became impossible to ignore. After we found out about the fire, the mood in the apartment changed forever. It was not only fear, it was as if the energy of the place had become heavier, more oppressive. Even without speaking openly, we began to avoid being alone. The nights became a challenge. Any noise, however small, made everyone gather in the room as if it was going to protect us. Even Peter, who was always the most depraved, began to get strange. He was quieter, more nervous. When we asked, he only said that he had a nightmare, but did not want to go into details. The situation became unbearable the next night. It was almost 11 o'clock and we were all awake, but no one wanted to say anything, as if we were waiting for the inevitable. Then the lights started flashing again, but this time for longer. When they came back, the bathroom door was wide open. We were sure it was closed because Lucas had just left. Then we heard the clearest sound of all, a laugh. It was low, slow, and seemed to come from inside the apartment. No one laughed, no one moved. We are paralyzed, feeling that inexplicable cold that only happens when you know something is wrong. That laugh was enough to make everyone lose their cool. Peter stood up suddenly and said, "Enough, I'll settle this now." He went straight to the front door of the manager, ignoring our requests to wait until morning. We didn't know what he was going to say or do, but we stayed at the apartment door, waiting for him to come back. About 10 minutes later, Peter came back, but he looked different. He didn't have the angry posture of before. He was quiet, pale, as if he had seen something that left him without ground. He just said, "We need to get out of here. Tomorrow." That made my stomach cold. We asked what Geraldo had said, but Pedro only answered, "We should not have stayed awake." That night, no one slept. Every sound, every shadow seemed ready to attack us. When the day finally came, Peter told what the manager said. According to Geraldo, he never wanted to rent that apartment to anyone, but the owner insisted because the building had been empty for a long time. He said that since the fire, all residents who stayed in our apartment reported the same things: beats, steps, and finally something they called the visit. He did not explain what it was, but said that after this began, no one could stay in the apartment anymore. Geraldo just gave advice: never go past 11 o'clock again. After hearing what Peter told us, we all panicked. The idea that other people had gone through it and left the apartment made everything seem even more real. We started packing our things immediately. No one wanted to spend another night there. The problem was that while we were packing things up, the clock seemed to run faster than normal. When we realized it was almost 10 p.m. and there was still a lot to finish, Luke suggested we leave the rest and come back another day, but Peter insisted that it was better to take everything at once. At 10:55 p.m., the weather in the apartment was unbearable. The beatings started again, but now they came from all sides: ceiling, floor, walls. It was as if the whole building was alive. The lights started flashing nonstop, and the air became so cold that it seemed hard to breathe. Then we heard something different. There were no more footsteps or beats. It was a sound of dragging, as if someone was being pulled in the corridor. It made everyone freeze. When Julia opened the door to look, she gave a scream and fell back. In the corridor, there was no one, but the scratches on the floor went straight to our door. When we saw the marks on the ground, it was as if reality had finally reached us. That was not something we could explain or ignore. We closed the door tightly and pushed the couch against it, as if that would prevent anything from entering. Pedro began to pray softly, something I had never seen before. Julia was shaking and holding Lucas's arm as if she were going to faint. I didn't know what to think or how to act, but the sound in the hall continued. The banging, scratching, and that horrible dragging, as if something was waiting for us to open the door again. That's when it happened. The sound stopped. The silence was so deep that it hurt my ears. We were looking at each other, not knowing if we should move. It was when the lights went out for good. Total pitch took over the apartment, and I felt something pass by me like a cold wind, but denser, heavier. Julia started crying, and I could barely breathe. Then, out of nowhere, the lights came back, and there it was, a piece of paper in the middle of the room that wasn't there before. Peter took it with trembling hands and read aloud, "The visit is done. You cannot return." The message on paper was the drop of water. Pedro threw the paper to the floor and, without saying anything, began to push boxes to the door. No one argued. We were all so terrified that we just wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. We were dumping things in the corridor and did not think of who could be watching. While we carried what we could to Pedro's car, we felt something that I will never forget. The feeling of being observed. It was not paranoia, it was a presence. It seemed to be coming from inside the apartment, watching us as we left, as if he knew that we were powerless against her. When we put the last box in the car, Julia looked at the apartment window and screamed. We all looked at the same time and saw what had shocked her. There was something inside, standing in the room. It was just a silhouette, without face or clear shape, but the feeling that it conveyed was impossible to ignore. We didn't stay to look for long. We got in the car and left as fast as we could. Peter was the last to leave, and when he locked the door, I remember him saying softly, almost as if he were talking to himself, "They did not want us to go." After that night, we never went back to the apartment. We paid a fine for breaking the contract, but nobody cared. Everything we left behind was there, and none of us had the courage to seek. We tried to move on with our lives, but some things did not return to normal. Pedro started having anxiety attacks, Julia moved to another city, and Lucas just stopped talking about what happened. To this day, I can't get through old buildings without feeling that cold in my spine. Sometimes I have nightmares about the banging, the scratching, and that presence watching. I never told anyone, but a week later I received an envelope at my new home. Inside, there was only a piece of paper with the same handwriting as the message we found in the apartment. He said, "You may have gone out, but we are still here." Since then, I try to forget what happened, but it's like it has left a mark, something that I will never be able to erase. Don't know who or what was in that place, but I know I never want to find out. The radio that knew too much. I have always been a practical, skeptical person. I have been a journalist for more than 10 years, and during this time, I learned to trust facts more than sensations or coincidences. In 2019, I was living alone in a small apartment in the city center. It was a simple but comfortable place with that retro charm of old buildings. On a Saturday, while exploring an antique fair in the neighborhood, I found an old radio, one of those wooden ones, with big buttons that looked like they came out of a movie. It was well worn, with the paint peeled and glass cracked, but something in it caught my eye. I can't explain why. The seller told me it still worked and sold me for a bargain. I decided to take it, thinking that it would be a good decorative item for my office. That night, I put the radio on the shelf and tried to turn it on. It still worked, but did not catch any stations clearly. It was all static and squeaking, as if it was stuck on an out-of-use frequency. Out of curiosity, I left it on while doing other things. It was then that I heard something that made me shiver. Amidst the white sound, a voice emerged. It was not a normal broadcast like music or news. It was a conversation, two people talking as if they were in a nearby place. One of them laughed, and then I heard my name clearly being mentioned. "Anna should have known," someone said. I was paralyzed. At the time, I thought it was a coincidence, maybe an interference with some nearby radio. But deep down, something seemed wrong. Turned off the radio at the same time. My heart was racing, but I tried to convince myself that it was just interference. Maybe someone using a walkie-talkie or some pirate station caught by chance. Still, I couldn't get it out of my head. Who are those people? And why did my name appear in the conversation? I went to sleep trying to forget, but something in the back of my mind did not leave me calm. The next day, while working at home, I decided to turn on the radio again. Part of me wanted to prove that there was nothing strange, that it was just my imagination. But instead of static, the same male voice came out, speaking as if it was continuing from where it left off. This time he was describing something I had done that morning. She went out in her pajamas to get the paper in the hall. Still like cinnamon coffee. I was cold. It was impossible for anyone to know that. I didn't tell anyone about this habit, and the newspaper was in the corridor of the building where no one could see me. Took my phone and tried to record, but when I gave the play, there was only static on the recording. The sound sounded clean while I listened, but left no trace. I turned off the radio once more, and at that moment I realized I couldn't just ignore what was going on. I needed to find out where this sign came from. I spent the rest of the day researching everything I could about old radios and interference. I found that older radios, like the one I bought, sometimes pick up frequencies that are not accessible by modern devices. They can be amateur radio stations, pirate stations, or even satellite signals. That calmed me down a bit, but still didn't explain why they mentioned such specific details of my life. I decided to test something. I turned the radio back on, exactly at 8 p.m., recording the frequencies while turning the button. The sound was static for a while, until the voice came back. This time, it was the same person as before, but he was talking about a trip I did years ago. She was afraid to go into the sea that day in a rail. My stomach turned. I haven't told anyone since it happened. It was a trip that I did alone, and only I knew about this detail. When the voice stopped, a song started playing, but it was distorted, as if out of rhythm. I took my phone again and tried to record. Nothing. Just static, like before. I decided to do something that seemed absurd, but I was desperate for answers. I spoke to the radio. I asked, "Who are you? How do you know these things about me?" There was no immediate response, but after a few seconds the music stopped and I heard a different sound. It was like a click, followed by a heavy breath, as if someone was listening from the other side. That breath left me completely paralyzed. It was slow and irregular, as if someone was there trying to intimidate. My first instinct was to turn off the radio and throw it in the trash, but at the same time I couldn't move. It was as if something in that sound hypnotized me, as if I needed to hear what came next. Then, finally, I heard a sentence spoken clearly and directly. "You should not have asked." The radio turned off by itself immediately after, without me even touching it. The house was completely silent, and I felt a shiver go through my spine. I ran to turn everything off, but the radio was already disconnected. I tried to convince myself that it was some kind of hallucination, maybe fatigue or stress, but I knew it wasn't. I spent the rest of the night restlessly, checking windows and doors to make sure they were locked. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, when I finally started to relax, I heard a sound coming from the room. It was the radio, which I had left on the shelf. He was on again, even without being connected to the power. The squeal was louder this time, almost deafening. I took a cushion to muffle the sound, but before I could do anything else, a phrase came up in the middle of the static. "We are closer than you think." That was enough to make me lose control. I took the radio from the bookcase and, without thinking too much, threw it on the floor with all my strength. He broke into pieces, and the squeal stopped immediately. I stood there, panting, looking at the scattered pieces, trying to understand what was happening. But the silence did not bring any relief. On the contrary, the feeling of being observed became even stronger, as if the radio had been only a channel, not the origin. I decided to sleep at a friend's house that night. I called Mariana, who lived nearby, and made up an excuse that I needed company. When I got there, I tried to act normal, but my mind did not stop spinning. I told her part of what happened, but you left out the most frightening details because you knew it would sound crazy. During the early morning, I suddenly woke up with my phone vibrating on the bedside table. It was a message from an unknown number. The message said, "You can't run away from it." I was shocked. I looked at Mariana, who was still sleeping deeply, and almost woke her up, but something held me. My heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. And it was then that I realized the radio was not just any object. It was as if I had opened something, and access to something or someone who knew more about me than I did. The next morning, I came back to my apartment with a knot in my stomach. Part of me didn't want to face the place, but I needed to understand what was happening. When I entered, the radio was still on the ground, broken into pieces. I took a bag and started to collect the remains, but I noticed something strange. Inside the casing, there was a folded piece of paper, as if it had been placed there on purpose. I opened it carefully and saw a series of numbers written down, like coordinates. It didn't make sense. I took the paper to the computer and played the numbers in Google Maps. The result left me speechless. They were coordinates of a park that was a few blocks from my apartment. It seemed absurd, but something inside me told me that I needed to go there. Took my backpack, put the paper inside, and I walked with my heart in my throat. When I arrived at the park, the place was empty. It was early, and the day was cloudy, which only left the environment more strange. The coordinates led me to an area near an artificial lake. There was nothing special there, only trees and benches. But when I started exploring, I noticed something on the ground. It was a small audio recorder, one of those very old ones, covered with leaves. I took the device carefully and noticed that there was a tape inside. Couldn't resist. I pressed the play button. The sound coming out of the recorder was low, almost muffled, but it was enough to make me freeze in place. It was the same voice I had heard on the radio. "You found it fast. I knew you would come." My heart popped. That seemed impossible. As the tape continued, the voice began to list more details of my life. Where I studied, where I grew up, even the name of my childhood dog. It was a flood of personal information, said casually, as if I was being watched all my life. Then suddenly the voice changed tone. It became more low, almost angry. "You should have stopped when you had the chance. Now there's no turning back." I was paralyzed, holding the recorder as if it were going to explode. Before I could hang up, the voice said something that made me shiver from head to toe. "Look back." By reflection, I turned my face at the same time, but there was no one. The park remained empty, except for the sound of wind in the trees. Even then I felt a presence. It was impossible to explain, as if someone was close enough to touch me, but invisible. Threw the recorder on the floor and ran. I did not look back, did not stop to breathe. just ran until I was safe inside my apartment. When I locked the door, I fell to the ground. I knew that whatever it was, it hadn't finished with me. I spent the rest of the day trying to ignore what had happened, but it was impossible. Every little noise in the apartment seemed amplified. Every shadow on the walls seemed to be moving. I decided to turn off all the lights and tuck myself under the covers, as if that was going to protect me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. In the middle of the morning, I woke up suddenly. My room was cold, colder than it should be, and a low and continuous sound echoed through the house. It was familiar. It looked static, like the one on the radio. I took my cell phone to light up the room, and in the corner I saw something that almost made me scream. The recorder was there, the same one I had left in the park. It was intact, with the tape running but no sound. Looking, unable to move until the tape stopped. A click echoed through the room, and then a new sentence appeared. It was not a recorded voice this time. It was someone or something talking there at that moment. No point running away. We are here. It was when something fell from my bedside table. It was the piece of paper with the coordinates, which I had left in my backpack. When I looked at him, the coordinates were crossed out, and in place there was only one word, end. After that night, there were no more sounds, voices, or static. It was as if everything had really ended. The next day, I took the recorder and the radio scraps and threw them all in a trash container in a distant neighborhood. Part of me wanted to believe that, by getting rid of these objects, I was closing everything. But the silence that followed did not bring the peace I had hoped for. On the contrary, it was oppressive, as if something was waiting for the right time to come back. I spent weeks avoiding my apartment at night, leaving for work early, and coming back only when I was exhausted. Life gradually returned to normal, but I could never forget what happened. I did not tell anyone, not even Mariana. I don't know what those voices were or why they knew so much about me, but to this day, I feel like it's never really gone. Sometimes when I pass an old radio or hear static by chance, my heart beats as if it is waiting to hear that voice again. I don't know how or why I was chosen for this, but since that day, I have lived with the constant feeling that someone somewhere is still listening to me. The figure in the frame. I am a primary school teacher and teach children from 9 to 10 years. I've been working in a public school for almost 8 years, and until then, I had never experienced anything that made me question my sanity. This story happened in 2021, in a strange period for everyone, just after the classroom classes returned. It was an old school, built in the 50s, with walls yellowed by time and a constant smell of mold that never left even with the windows open. My classroom was at the end of the corridor, a more isolated place, where children were always haunted because of the flashing lamps. It all started on a common Monday. I was explaining an exercise on the chalkboard, and when I turned to get the pile of notebooks, I noticed a drawing that wasn't there before. It was a simple figure, scribbled in the corner of the board. It looked like the outline of a person, but without a face, only an oval head and arms and legs too long to be proportional. I thought it was a joke from some student, but no one took over. I deleted the drawing and continued the class. That day I thought it was strange, but I did not give much importance. After all, children are creative and like to play tricks. On Tuesday it happened again. This time the figure appeared closer to the center of the picture, but still without details in the face or body. It was the same strange stroke, as if someone had scribbled fast and hard. I asked again who had done that, but all the students looked at me as if I was crazy. "Teacher, didn't you erase that yesterday?" one of them asked. The sentence made me uncomfortable. I erased the drawing again, but this time with more force, almost discounting the nervousness. I even played with them. If you're kidding, they're getting good at scaring me. On Wednesday, however, had no more to ignore. I entered the room before the signal hit, and the figure was already there, right in the center of the picture. This time she had something different. It seemed to have outstretched arms, as if it pointed at something, but there was nothing there. My head began to spin. I was absolutely sure that I had cleaned the picture the day before. I was so confused that I asked the coordinator for leave and left the class with another teacher. I spent the whole break trying to find a logical explanation. Could it be someone breaking into the room at night? But why do that? And why only that figure? That night, I decided I was going to stay late at school. I wanted to see if anyone was coming into the classroom after hours. I spoke to the caretaker, SU Jorge, a nice man who worked there for decades, and asked him not to lock my office until I leave. He thought it was strange, but did not question. I waited until the building was empty. The school at night was a scary place in itself, with the echo of footsteps in the corridors and the sound of wind beating in the poorly sealed windows. I stayed in my room, light off, only with the brightness of the phone to pass the time. It was almost 10 p.m. when I heard a noise coming from the corridor. It was a low sound, as if someone was dragging something on the floor. My heart pounded. Stood up and walked to the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. When I looked through the window of the door, I didn't see anyone, but the sound continued. I decided to go back inside and wait further. When I turned to the picture, I felt the blood freeze. The figure was there again, but this time it had something different. It seemed to have a face, or at least the outline of something like eyes and a mouth. The feeling of being observed was instantaneous. I was paralyzed looking at the picture. It was as if the figure had been made in front of me, but I had heard nothing but the sound in the corridor. I took my phone to take a picture, but as soon as I pointed the camera, the light in the room blinked and went out. My heart popped, and I felt my throat dry. I went to the switch in the entrance to try to turn on the light again, but nothing happened. When I looked back towards the frame, the figure seemed larger, almost filling the entire center of the blackboard. I can't explain, but I felt a wave of panic invade me, as if it was not just a drawing. Now the lines were clear, and the figure seemed to lean forward, as if it wanted to get out of the picture. But what left me in shock was what was written next to it, my name, in big and trembling letters, as if it had been made in a hurry. That vision took me from the ground. I knew it was no way for the children to play. Nobody had access to the room before I arrived, and the picture was completely clean when I left the day before. I stood there, looking at the drawing, feeling a lump in my throat. I asked the children to take their notebooks and go to the library, trying to keep calm in my voice. They realized something was wrong, but did not question. After the room was empty, I sat in my chair and looked at the painting, trying to understand what it meant. It was then that I started to feel something strange. The air seemed denser, almost heavy, as if the whole room was closing around me. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to gather courage to do something. I took an eraser and went towards the board. When I touched the drawing, I felt a shiver run through my arm. It was not a normal feeling. It was as if the chalk was hot, pulsating lightly under my hand. I erased the whole figure, line by line, and when I finished, I felt a wave of relief, as if the air had become lighter. But when I took a step back, I heard a sound that froze my spine. The sound of chalk scratching the picture again, only louder, faster. I turned around, and the figure was back, exactly where it had been before, but now with a clearly defined face. And worse, it was a familiar face. When I looked at the face drawn in the picture, my stomach turned. It was impossible, but it looked like my mother's face. Not as she was in the last years, but exactly as I remembered her when I was a child, before the accident that took her from me. The hair, the crooked smile, even the slightly slanted eyes she had when laughing. It didn't make sense, and I felt a mixture of fear and sadness that paralyzed me. My mother had died almost 20 years ago, and to see that face there, drawn with chalk, was like reliving the pain of loss in a single blow. Suddenly, the room became cold, and the sound of rattling wallets on the floor began to fill the room. It was as if someone was pushing the tables slowly, one by one, but there was no one there but me. The picture in the painting seemed more alive every second, as if it was watching me. I could not stand anymore and ran out, without looking back. I went straight to the coordination, with tears running down my face. I told the director, Donna Marta, but she only looked at me with that look people give when they think you're exaggerating. Honey, calm down. Maybe it's just tiredness. Do you want to take a few days off? She suggested. The suggestion of Donna Marta made me even more frustrated. I knew that it was not tiredness, and I was not imagining things. But I basically accepted the offer. I needed to get out of there, even for a day or two. Took my things, came home and tried to distract me, but I could not stop thinking about what I had seen. Why the face of my mother? What did that mean? There was something very wrong, and the feeling that I was being followed didn't leave me alone. In the evening, I decided to look in my closet for some old photos of her, trying to find some connection. While I was going through the pictures, I found something that made me freeze. Among the albums, there was an old notebook that I had not seen in years. It was my old childhood diary, something I used to use before my mother died. Flipping through the pages, I found a drawing. It was almost identical to the one on the chalkboard. The same figure without a face, but drawn with the childish traces of a child. On the next page, there was a scribbled text that I could barely read. My eyes struggled to decipher, and then I understood what was written. Mom is on the board. At that moment, I felt a shiver take over my body. It was as if everything was connected, but I still did not know how. After finding the drawing in my diary, I could not sleep. The phrase "Mama's on the board" seemed to echo in my mind without stopping. Revived memories I didn't even know were still there. As a child, I used to spend hours drawing with my mother. She always said that my talent with the pencil came from her, but after she died, I stopped drawing completely. What tormented me was how that drawing appeared in my diary. I had no memory of having done it, much less writing that sentence. Deep down, I felt that something from my childhood was trying to come back, something that maybe I had forgotten. The next morning, I decided to go back to school. I was no longer willing to run away. I needed to understand what was happening, even if it was painful. When I got into the room, everything seemed normal. The children were distracted, talking and laughing as if nothing had happened. But as I entered, the picture was gone. I took a deep breath, thinking that perhaps the janitor had cleaned everything the night before. During class, I forced myself to act as if everything was fine, but deep down, I was waiting for something. When the break started, I approached the painting alone. I took a chalk and wrote, "What do you want?" It was crazy, I know, but I needed an answer. I waited for a few minutes, looking at the board, waiting for an answer that I knew would not come. The room was completely silent, but the air seemed heavy, as if something was watching me. I turned to get my things, but when I looked again, the sentence I had written was gone. In the place, there was another message, written with the same trembling letter that I had seen before. "You already know." My heart popped, and I instinctively backed away. That was not normal. I was alone in the room, and no one could have written it. I decided it was time to face that. I needed to understand what this figure meant. Took the chalk again and wrote another question, trying not to let my hands shake. "Who are you?" I waited once more, and this time I saw the chalk move by itself, as if an invisible hand was writing. The words appear slowly but clearly. "I am part of you." My body became stiff. Didn't know what it meant, but at the same time I felt like a memory was trying to emerge. A memory buried long ago. It was then that something clicked in my mind. The picture, my mother's face, the drawing in the diary, everything was connected to something I had forgotten, or maybe blocked. At that moment, a whirlwind of memories began to return in a fragmented way. I remembered one night when I was a child, my mother and I were in the homeroom. She was drawing something on a large paper board that we had on the wall. It was a figure similar to the one on the chalkboard now, but without face. I remember asking why she was drawing that, and she just smiled, saying, "Sometimes we need to draw our fears so they don't control us." At the time, I did not understand what she meant, but that memory always had an uncomfortable, almost dark tone. Back in the room, I looked at the board with this fresh memory in my mind. I wrote a last question almost without thinking. What did I forget? This time the answer came faster, as if the figure was waiting for that question. The night she left. My heart stopped for a second. I had never talked about what happened the night my mother died. It was a hole in my memory, something I always attributed to the trauma. But now, it seemed that figure knew what I did not. Or maybe it was a part of me trying to remember. Take a deep breath, feeling the weight of that sentence. The night she left, my head was spinning, trying to piece together the pieces of memory that seemed distant, as if they were covered by a mist. I stared at the painting, hoping for something more, but nothing happened. Then, almost without noticing, my legs started moving, and I left the room as if on autopilot. I went to the school library, where I knew there were old records files. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I felt that something in that place could help me understand what was going on. After a few minutes of searching, I found a record of the time my mother was still alive. It was an old registration form from the time she taught at the same school I now worked. That gave me a shiver. I knew she had been a teacher, but I never imagined that it was precisely this school. I kept looking and, in the middle of a lot of unorganized papers, found a drawing scribbled on a yellowed leaf. It was the same figure without face, with arms outstretched, and in the corner, in a handwriting that I recognized as hers, it was written, "She knows what to do." The phrase in the drawing left me without a floor. She knows what to do. Who was she? Would my mother be talking about me, or about someone else? Confusion mixed with fear took hold of me, but at the same time I felt that I was getting closer to understanding what it meant. I took the paper and went back to the classroom, determined to confront whatever was going on. The room was empty as I had left it, but the air seemed even heavier than before. I went straight to the picture and, with my mother's drawing and figure in mind, wrote, "What do I need to do?" The answer appeared almost instantly, as if already written there, waiting for me to ask. "Remember." That's it. Remember. I took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of panic and anticipation. I closed my eyes and tried to concentrate. It was like opening a door that I didn't even know existed. The memory came back with a force that almost knocked me down. I was in the homeroom last night with my mother. She looked tense, different. He asked me to draw with her on the board, saying it was a game. I remember drawing the same picture as she whispered words that I did not understand. Only then I realized that she was crying, and soon after that, the light of the house blinked and she fell to the ground. The memory came like a punch. My mother fell to the ground, and I stood there paralyzed, not knowing what to do. I remembered her holding my hand before losing consciousness and whispering something that, until then, I had not been able to process. "Don't let him come back." Who was he? At the time, I was a scared child, unable to understand. But now, with everything that was happening, it made a disturbing sense. Felt my legs weak, and I leaned on the nearest table. That figure in the picture was not just a drawing. It was something my mother knew, something she tried to keep away from, and somehow left for me. I looked at the picture again, now with a mixture of fear and determination. I wrote again, "Who is he?" The chalk seemed to move by itself as before and formed a single word, shadow. The room became colder, and I felt that same presence, heavy and oppressive, which seemed to be getting closer. The sound of squeaking chairs filled the room, and the blackboard began to creak, as if it were to break in half. Took the eraser, desperate, and began to erase everything with force, screaming to go away. The sound stopped suddenly, and when I looked at the picture again, it was completely empty, as if nothing had happened. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to understand if it was really over. The picture was empty, but the room seemed strangely lighter, as if the heavy air that had been suffocating me before had disappeared. Sat in the nearest chair and put my head between my hands, trying to process everything. It was then that I noticed a low sound coming from the door. When I looked, it was his George, the caretaker. He held a cleaning cloth in his hand and looked at me with a serious, almost sad expression. "You did, didn't you?" he asked, and I just nodded. Your George sighed and walked into the room, closing the door behind him. I thought it would not happen again. Your mother managed to hold on for many years, you know? But these things have a way of coming back. I was shocked. He knew. He knew everything, but never said anything. I asked what he meant, and he explained that my mother had gone through the same thing when she taught there. According to him, that figure always appeared to those who had something she wanted, memories, fears, pieces of an incomplete story. She feeds on it, and my mother somehow managed to push her away, but it seemed like now it was my turn. What Lord George said made me panic. But why me? What does that have to do with me? I asked, almost screaming. He sat down on one of the chairs, sighed and said, "Your mother was a very strong woman, but she carried a burden that no one understood. When it came to her, she knew she needed to protect you, but never told me how she managed to get the shadow away, as she called it." My mind was spinning as he spoke. It was like all the pieces were starting to fit together, but there was still a crucial part missing. What did my mother do that last night? Why did she make me draw it? Sir George continued. She told me once, just before leaving, that the shadow only comes back when she feels someone is vulnerable, stuck in the past. Maybe that's it. Maybe you're holding something she thought she had solved. Your words hit me like a wave. I spent years avoiding thinking about my mother's death, blocking everything that happened that night. But somehow this thing found a way to come back, to hit me where I was weakest. I decided that I could not run anymore. If it needed something to continue, I had to cut the connection. I decided that I needed to face it once and for all, even without knowing exactly how. I asked SCU Jorge if he knew anything else, something my mother had left for me. He thought for a moment and then said, "When your mother left school, she kept something in the storeroom." I never had the courage to move. Without wasting time, I went with him to the basement of the school, a place that seemed forgotten in time. The smell of mold was strong, and the shelves were covered with dust. He pointed to a small box, my name handwritten on the lid. It was her handwriting. Open the box carefully, as if something were to jump out of it. Inside there was a single item, a small wooden frame with an old mirror. I remembered seeing it in our homeroom when I was a child, but never knew why my mother had kept it so carefully. On the back of the mirror, there was a note written by her. "If the shadow returns, show it to her. Do not fear. She can only take what you give." The words gave me shivers from head to toe, but at the same time gave me a little hope. Maybe that was the key to ending everything. With the mirror in my hands, I returned to the classroom. Each step seemed heavier, as if the air around me was closing. When I entered the room, I noticed that the environment had changed. The lights were dim, flashing from time to time, and the blackboard was no longer empty. The figure had returned, sharper and more threatening than ever. This time, it seemed to be almost coming out of the frame, with his arm extended forward, as if he wanted to reach me. My hands trembled, but I held the mirror firmly, remembering my mother's words, "Do not fear." I went to the painting, approaching slowly, trying to keep calm. When I was a few steps away, the room froze, and I heard the sound of chairs dragging. The figure in the picture seemed to move. It was subtle, but I could swear that I saw her tilt her head to the side as if she was watching me. Raised the mirror and, with a mixture of fear and determination, pointed the reflection directly to the picture. At the moment I did this, the air seemed to break apart, like the sound of a glass shattering. The picture began to disappear, piece by piece, until the frame was empty again. The whole room seemed to breathe relieved, as if a dense energy had been expelled. After the figure disappeared, silence took over the room. It was no longer the heavy silence of before, but something different, almost comforting. The picture was clean, without any trace of what had happened. I sat in one of the chairs and stood there for a few minutes, trying to process everything. When I got up to leave, I noticed that the mirror was still in my hand. The reflection seemed common, but there was something strange. For a second, I thought I saw my mother's face there, smiling lightly, but when I blinked, it was just my reflection again. I took the mirror home, and since then, I have kept it in a safe place, away from everything and everyone. The classroom was back to normal, and I never saw the picture in the painting again. Sometimes I really managed to kick that, or if she just went somewhere else, waiting for another opportunity. What I do know is that since that day, I have learned not to ignore the signs and, more importantly, to face my fears instead of running away from them. My mother somehow protected me to the end, and I know that mirror was the key. Until today, I have not fully understood what happened, but I am at peace to have faced it. For now, the pictures we never took. This happened about a year ago, and to this day I cannot explain right where we lived. My family has always had the habit of recording important moments in photos and hanging them on the wall of the room. It was almost a tradition. Birthdays, trips, special occasions, everything was there. We had a wall full of small pictures with these photos, and it was something that all the visitors of the house praised. At the time, I lived with my husband, Ricardo, and our 8-year-old daughter, Sophia. Life was quiet, without anything extraordinary, until that particular night. I remember well because it was a Sunday. I spent the day cleaning the house, and when I finished, I took a quick look at the wall of photos. Everything was normal, each picture in the usual place. But the next morning something bothered me. One of the pictures was missing. It was a photo from a walk in the park that we did months before, one of my favorites. I asked Ricardo if he had moved, but he said no. Sophia also denied. I thought it might have fallen, so I looked behind the sofa, in the corners of the floor, but I didn't find anything. At that moment, I thought maybe it was just carelessness or someone had taken it and forgot to tell me. The next night, we were all in the living room watching TV when I noticed something strange on the wall. In the place where the photo had disappeared, there was now a new one. But what made me most uncomfortable was the fact that I did not recognize that image. It was a photo of us, the three of us, but in a place we do not remember having been. It looked like an open field, with trees in the background, and we were all smiling. The detail that scared me was that Sophia wore a dress I had never bought, and Ricardo held a hat he doesn't have. I asked, laughing nervously, if someone had edited the photo or put it there as a joke, but no one could explain. Ricardo, always skeptical, said that I should have forgotten when we took, but I knew that was not possible. I am very organized with family photos and would never hang something without remembering. I decided to take the photo off the wall and look closely. The paper looked real, like any other printed photo, but the feeling I had holding it was strange, almost as if it was out of place, as if it should not exist. I kept the photo in a drawer and tried not to think too much about it. We thought it was just a coincidence, or maybe we were exaggerating. But when I woke up the next day, there was another new picture on the wall, and this time the image was disturbing. The new photo was completely different from all the others. It wasn't cheerful, nor was it taken in a beautiful place. It showed only our front gate, but at night, illuminated by the lights of the street post. Ricardo was in the photo, standing at the gate, looking inside the house, with a look that I could only describe as strange, almost empty. Sophia and I didn't show up, which was weird in itself because we always took pictures together. It was as if someone had taken that picture outside the house, but this was impossible. We had not received anyone recently, and who would take a photo of our gate like that, without warning? Ricardo tried to justify. He said that maybe it was some joke from Sophia or even mine, and I was forgetting. But this time, even he seemed more uncomfortable. I took the picture and looked again, trying to find some detail that made sense. I realized then that the shirt he was wearing in the photo was the same one he was wearing at that exact moment. When I pointed this out, he was silent, clearly unresponsive. We decided to keep this photo together with the other in the same drawer. I thought it was better not to hang anything on the wall until I understand what was happening. Only that night, something happened that changed everything. That night, I went to sleep with a heavy feeling, as if something was wrong with the house. It was past midnight when I woke up to a strange noise coming from the room. It was a low sound, as if something was scratching the wall. My first instinct was to think it was the wind or maybe some animal, but when I got up to check, I found something that made me freeze. The wall pictures were all crooked, some almost falling. But the worst was to see that there was another new picture. This was even more scary. The photo showed Sophia sleeping, exactly as she was at that moment in her bed. The framing was perfect, as if someone had been standing next to her holding the camera. My mind began to run in circles. Who took that picture? How did it get there? I took the photo with my hands shaking and called Ricardo, who came running when he heard the tone of my voice. I showed him, and for the first time he had no explanation. He looked at the picture and then at me, clearly shaken. Sophia still slept in the room, but I no longer felt that we were safe. We decided to stay up the rest of the night, with all lights on. While we were in the room, trying to understand what was happening, I realized that the feeling of being watched did not pass. It was as if something or someone were there with us, but out of our reach. I took the photos from the drawer where I had stored the previous ones and started to examine them again. What caught my attention was a detail I had not noticed before. In each of the photos, there was something out of the ordinary, almost imperceptible. In the field photo, in the background, among the trees, there seemed to be a shadow of a figure that was none of us. In the photo of the gate, reflected in the window of the room, there was a contour that did not make sense. It was something big, shapeless. As I processed this, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen, as if something had fallen. Ricardo went there with a flashlight, since the lights of that part of the house were off. I was alone in the room, holding the photos, when I noticed something else bizarre. There was a faint glow coming from the wall where the photos were hanging. As I approached, I saw that the marks on the frames, which were supposed to be covered with dust, looked fresh, as if someone had just moved the photos back into place. But I had taken them all. I looked into the drawer where we kept them, opened it, and they were still there. It was at this moment that I heard Ricardo screaming from the kitchen. Ran to the kitchen with a heart pounding. I found Ricardo standing in the middle of the room, pale, looking at the door that led to the backyard. He pointed without saying anything, and it was then that I saw there was a new picture on the floor right at the foot of the door. Took the photo carefully, and the image was disturbing. It showed the outside of our house, exactly as it was at that moment, with the lights on and the curtains of the room slightly open. It was as if someone had taken the photo out while watching us. Ricardo pulled me away from the door and locked all the locks, as if this would solve something, but we knew that we were dealing with something that was not normal. We decided to wake Sophia and leave the house immediately. Ricardo put her in the car while I tried to get the basics, documents, keys, and some clothes. Before leaving, I looked at the wall of the photos once more. The frames were all in place, but now each one showed something that was not possible. A sequence of images as if they were frames from a movie. In each one, our house seemed darker and empty, until the last one had only an empty frame, without any photo. That was enough. I ran to the car, and we left without looking back. We left driving aimlessly, only with the intention of staying as far away from home as possible. We stopped at a simple hotel in the neighboring town and put Sophia to sleep. She fortunately had not understood the gravity of what was happening, but me and Ricardo were in shock. Sitting in the bed of the room, we discussed what to do. The idea of going back home seemed impossible. Ricardo suggested calling the police, but how can we explain that without sounding crazy? We decided to wait until the next day to think more clearly. The next morning, Ricardo decided to go to the house to get some more things and make sure everything was locked. I didn't want to go, but he insisted that it was better to solve this quickly. When he came back, he was pale and shaking. He said the photos had disappeared. All. The wall was completely empty, without frames, without marks, as if we had never put anything there. This left us with more questions than answers. Since then, we never lived in that house again. We sold the property shortly after and moved to a more distant place. To this day, the photos never reappeared, but sometimes I have the feeling that someone or something is still watching us, waiting for the right time to make another visit. The wrong fate. This happened 2 years ago, in a period when I was trying to reorganize myself. I had just moved into a small apartment in the city center. Nothing too much, but perfect for starting over. I had ended a complicated relationship, changed jobs, and was focused on disconnecting from the past. The routine was simple: work, gym, and quiet nights watching TV. I never had a lot of orders, so when a package arrived on an ordinary morning, I found it strange. had not asked for anything, but the delivery man insisted that the address was correct. I accepted the package, thinking it could be a mistake from some neighbor. When I opened it, I realized that it was not normal. Inside the envelope, there was a set of photos printed on high-quality paper. The problem is that they were photos of me taken from inside my apartment. Some showed the couch where I was sitting the night before, others the kitchen, and one of them showed me sleeping in bed. The camera seemed to be at a high angle, as if it had been placed in a corner I could not identify. My heart popped. Seeing those images made me feel exposed, vulnerable, as if someone was there with me. I spent the whole morning trying to figure out who could have done it, but I couldn't think of anyone. I spent the whole day paranoid, searching every corner of the apartment for hidden cameras or anything that could explain those photos. I climbed up into chairs, opened the cabinets, even took out the paintings from the walls, but found nothing. The feeling of being observed did not pass. I started to think if it could be someone in the building, some neighbor with easy access to the apartment, but the place had reasonable security, and the doorman never mentioned anything suspicious. To make matters worse, the envelope had no sender, stamp, or any indication of where it came from. It was as if the package had come out of nowhere, only to hit me. The next night another package arrived. This time it was a small box with my name and address written by hand. When I opened it, I found something even more disturbing: a key, a ticket, and more photos. The ticket said only, "You will need this." The photos were more recent, clearly taken after I received the first envelope. One of them showed the moment when I was on the couch, holding the photos from the previous day. Another showed the door of my apartment open, as if someone had just left. I felt the floor disappear. It did not make sense. I was sure the door was locked all along. Whoever was doing this wanted me to know that I could come in and out whenever I wanted. After finding the key and the new photos, I entered a state of alertness that I had never felt before. I spent the whole night sitting on the couch with all the lights on, holding a kitchen knife as if it was protecting me. Every little sound in the corridor made me jump. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard footsteps outside the door, but when I looked through the peephole, the corridor was empty. I decided to check the door. It was locked, as it should be, but the key that came in the box seemed to fit perfectly into the lock. I tested carefully, and she opened the door as if it were my own key. The next day, I took a break from work and went straight to the building's concierge. I showed the photos to the doorman, a gentleman named Mario, who was always attentive. He was as scared as me. We reviewed the security camera footage, but there was nothing. Neither the delivery man, nor anyone entering or leaving my apartment. It was as if the packages had appeared out of nowhere. Mario suggested that I call the police, but something told me that this would not solve anything. Whoever was doing this seemed to be teasing me, playing with my mind. And then in the late afternoon, I got a third package. The third package arrived when I was about to go out for help. This time, it was an even simpler envelope, just with my name written by hand. There was no stamp, or any indication that it had passed through the post office. When I opened, my heart almost stopped. Inside there was a single photo, I as a child, in front of the house where I grew up. But the strangest thing was that the photo was taken from an angle I had never seen before. It seemed to have been taken from outside the house, as if someone was watching us that day. The detail that chilled me most was seeing my old bike leaning against the fence, something I had not seen in decades. Along with the photo, there was a short note. I never left. At that moment, a memory began to form in my head. It was a memory of when I was about 8 years old. I remembered a man who worked for my family as a gardener, Mr. Giraldo. He was always strange, appeared suddenly, spoke little, but knew too much about our routine. After my parents fired him, he just disappeared. I never heard from him again. But why would he do it now, so many years later? And how did he know where I lived? I held the photo for a while, trying to process what was happening. Could it be that Mr. Giraldo was really behind this? And if so, why? He was someone I hardly remembered, but now seemed to be present in a way that I could not ignore. The note, photos, key. Everything seemed to be pointing to him. I decided I needed to do something. I took the key from the second package and decided to test in a place that seemed logical. The house where I grew up. Didn't know what to expect, but something told me the answer was there. When I arrived, the house was empty. After my parents moved, it was closed for years for sale, but no one ever bought it. I used the key on the front door, and to my surprise it unlocked perfectly. The feeling of entering the house was surreal, as if I was invading a forgotten piece of my life. Everything was covered in dust, but exactly as I remembered. In the back of the room, I saw something that made me freeze. A table with a pile of envelopes identical to those I had received. There was also an old camera, one of those film, pointed at the door, as if it were waiting for me. Seeing that camera left me completely paralyzed. It was like she was there to record my reaction, or maybe something even worse. I approached slowly with my hands shaking and opened the envelope that was on top of the pile. Inside there were more photos, but this time they weren't just pictures of my apartment. Some showed the outside of the house where I was at that time, with a recent date handwritten on the back. Someone had been there watching, waiting. What scared me the most was finding a picture of the same room I was in now, taken from the same angle I was standing. I decided to open the rest of the envelopes. Most of them contained photos of places I knew. My old school, the house of friends I visited as a child, and even the bank where I work now. It was as if someone had documented every detail of my life, watching closely for decades. At the bottom of the pile, I found another note. "It's time to remember." That phrase hit me like a punch in the stomach. Remember what? I felt a wave of panic grow. I tried to convince myself that all this was some kind of sick joke, but deep down I knew it was more than that. As I held that last note, I felt a shiver that seemed to come from inside the house. The room, which was once quiet, now seemed to have gained a barely perceptible sound, something like the squeak of a running recording tape. I looked around, trying to locate the source, and it was then that I noticed a portable recorder in a corner of the room, on top of a stool. It was old, of those who used tapes, and was on, but did not emit any sound. I approached carefully and pressed the stop button. As soon as I did that, the house went back to absolute silence. But the tape recorder had a tape inside. I took the tape with my trembling hands, and as much as my instinct told me not to listen, I knew that I had to find out what was on it. I found an old player in one of the lockers and put the tape on. At first, I only heard a hiss, but soon a male voice started talking. Immediately I recognized it was Mr. Giraldo. "You don't remember, but I was there. I always was. They said I should take care of you, and I did. Until you grew up and forgot." The voice was calm, almost gentle, but the content was disturbing. The recording ended with a sentence that left me breathless. "I will get what is mine." That last sentence echoed in my mind. I'm going to get what's mine. My body was paralyzed, but my head was spinning. What did he mean? What did he think was his? The squeal of the tape was still on the recorder, even after the message had ended, as if something was yet to happen. Then I heard the sound of footsteps. They were coming from upstairs. The feeling that I was not alone in the house became unbearable. I took a chair to support me, trying to control my breath. My instinct was to run away, but my legs didn't move. The steps stopped suddenly, followed by a more subtle sound, a creaking door. Something or someone was there, and I needed to find out what it was. I took a flashlight that was in one of the cabinets and climbed up the stairs carefully, each step creaking under my feet. The door of my old room was half open, and the light of the lantern revealed something that made me shiver. In the center of the room was a wooden chair, and on top of it was a single envelope. Took the envelope carefully, almost hoping something would come out of it. When I opened it, I found a single photo. It was an image of me, taken at that exact moment, with my back up the stairs. Seeing that picture was like being punched in the stomach. I was there on my back, going up the stairs, just as I had just done. But the angle was impossible. It was as if someone was after me, but I knew there was no one there. Or at least I thought I did. Dropped the picture on the floor and looked around, feeling every muscle of my body locked. I instinctively turned to look at the corridor where I had come, but it was empty. The silence in the house was now absolute, as if even the sound of my breath was muffled. I decided I couldn't stand there anymore. I took the flashlight and started to go down the stairs as fast as I could. When I arrived in the room, I noticed that the photos on the table, those I had found in the envelope, were gone. The camera, the recorder, and even the stack of envelopes, everything was gone. Only the emptiness remained. I stood still for a moment, trying to understand what was happening until I heard a sound that froze my blood. It was the front door squeaking, as if someone was coming in. I ran out the back door without looking back and only stopped when I was already in my car. After getting in the car, I locked the doors and accelerated, not even knowing where I was going. The only thing I wanted was to put as much distance between me and that house as possible. On the way, I tried to call some friends, but no one answered. I didn't know if it was bad luck or something worse. I ended up going to a motel out of town, where I finally could stop and breathe. But the relief was short-lived. When I entered the room, I realized that I was not really alone. On the bed there was another envelope. Could not understand how he had appeared there. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was a last picture. It was a picture of me, sitting in the bed where I was at that moment, holding the envelope. The only difference was the reflection in the mirror behind me. On it, there was someone, a tall man standing at the door of the room, with an expression that I could not distinguish. Before I could process, I heard the door of the motel room behind me. When I turned around, the room was empty. There was no one there. I left everything behind and ran away, and since then I have never been back to that city. To this day, I don't know who the man was or how he did it, but I have a feeling that he is still watching me, waiting for the right time to come back. The beats no one saw. This story happened about 6 months ago, when I was still living with my family in a house in the country. It was a simple but spacious house with a large yard and several windows that looked out onto an open field in the back. I lived with my wife, Marina, and our 2 children, Clara and Joao, 9 and 7 years old. It all started very subtly, with the sound of light banging on the windows during the night. At first, we thought it was the wind, branches, or even some animal passing through the yard. It was common to have foxes and cats in the area, so we ignored them. But after a week, the beats began to happen exactly at midnight. It was so punctual that, when the clock struck 11:59 p.m., I was already prepared to hear the sound. It was 3 beats in a row, always at the same rhythm, as if someone was touching the window calmly but insistently. We decided to take a look. We searched the yard with lanterns, looked at all the windows, but never found anything. It started to get stranger when we noticed that the sound was changing place, as if it were going from one window to another. The children began to be frightened, and I realized that I could not ignore anymore. After a few nights with the same beats, we decided to install cameras outside the house. The idea was to finally find out what was causing it. I put a camera facing the yard and another pointed to the front of the house, covering all main windows. That night, at 11:59 p.m., we waited with the lights off and the monitor of the cameras on. When midnight came, the beats began, first in the living room window and then in the kitchen. I ran to check the recordings, but something was wrong. The videos had cuts of exactly 5 minutes, always before the beats began. It didn't make sense. The cameras were new, and they had never been a problem before. I became so obsessed with it that I started reviewing the old recordings. It was then that I noticed something that made me shiver. Just before each cut, there was a shadow in the corner of the video. It was not clear or defined, but looked like a silhouette of a person standing at the edge of the camera's field of view. The most disturbing thing was that the shadow did not move. It seemed to be just watching. I showed it to Marina, who was as scared as I. We decided that night we would stay up to personally observe what was happening. But what happened next was much more frightening than anything I could have imagined. We decided to turn off all the lights and hide near the window of the room, which was the one that seemed to be the most targeted by the beats. Marina got her phone ready to record while I held a flashlight. When the clock struck 11:59 p.m., silence took over the house. It was as if the whole room was waiting. At midnight sharp, the beats began. 3 firm beats followed by silence. Then 3 more, this time in the kitchen window. I ran there with the flashlight, but there was nothing, only the reflection of the empty yard on the glass. We went back to check the cameras in real time, but again the videos were cut. This time, Marina pointed something I had not noticed before. The shadows that appeared before the cuts were closer to the house, almost touching the windows. The scariest thing is that one of them seemed to be looking directly at the camera, as if it knew we were watching. Marina started to panic and wanted to call the police, but I hesitated. How to explain to them something that seemed so impossible? So I decided to go to the backyard to try and find some concrete evidence. I took a knife from the kitchen, lit the lantern, and left alone, while Marina was with the children in the room. When I went out in the yard, the air seemed heavier, as if something was surrounding me. The lantern lit up the lawn and the trees in the background, but there was no sign of anything or anyone. I walked to the kitchen window, where the last bangs had been, and I leaned down to look for marks on the glass or floor. It was then that I noticed something strange. There were footprints on the lawn. They did not look like an animal or a common person. They were long and thin marks, as if something had dragged stretched feet across the ground. My heart pounded. The footprints came from the direction of the field behind the house and ended right at the window, but there was no turning back. I started to follow the trail with the flashlight, but it disappeared before it reached the open field. It was as if the thing had simply vanished. Ran back inside, trying to look calm so as not to scare Marina and the children. When I entered the room, Marina was looking at the monitor of the cameras with wide eyes. "It appeared again," she said, pointing to the screen. On the recording before the cut, you could clearly see a standing figure in the yard. She was tall, thin, and looked like she was leaning, almost bent toward the window. The worst thing was that she wasn't alone on the recording. There were two other figures beside her, and they were all looking in the same direction, the camera. After seeing those figures on the tapes, a sense of insecurity took hold of all of us. Marina started crying softly, and the children, even in the room, realized that something was wrong. We did not know what to do. Calling the police seemed pointless, but we also couldn't just ignore what was going on. We decided that the only sensible thing was to leave the house that night. We packed some clothes and put the children in the car. Before leaving, I went to check the cameras one last time, hoping to find some clues. It was then that I realized something even more frightening. The time of the cuts in the recordings corresponded exactly to the moment when I was in the yard. Those figures were there as I looked for them. I could have passed by them without noticing. The idea made me feel a chill in my spine that I had never experienced. We took the car and drove to my in-laws' house, about half an hour away. Along the way, I looked in the rear-view mirror several times, with the feeling that we were being followed, but the road was empty. When we arrived, we decided not to tell everything to the in-laws, just said that had something strange and that we would rather spend the night there. While everyone was trying to rest, I stayed awake, flipping through the images on my phone, trying to find some pattern or something that made sense. The next morning, I went home alone while Marina and the children stayed at their in-laws' house. The idea was to take more important things and, perhaps, install new cameras or change something that could prevent the beats. When I entered, the house seemed quieter than normal, as if the air was still. I checked the windows and rooms, but nothing seemed out of place. The monitor of the cameras, however, was off even though it was connected to power. I went to the yard and, once again, found the same long and thin footprints, now spread over different points of the lawn. They seemed to lead to the back fence, but again disappeared. When I came back inside, I realized that something had changed. On the kitchen table, there was an object that I did not remember having left. A small smooth stone, almost like a piece of marble. I picked it up carefully, and soon realized that there was something engraved on it, a kind of symbol or drawing that I did not recognize. It was strange and incomprehensible, but it seemed deliberate, as if it had been left on purpose. At that moment, I realized it was no use fighting against it or trying to understand. I took what I needed and left the house for the last time. Since then, we never lived there again. We sold the house months later, without telling the new owners what happened. The beats stopped, at least for us, but I still have nightmares with those curved figures and footprints that ended without explanation. To this day, I don't know who or what was knocking on our windows, but whatever it is, I hope you never find us again. The images I never took. I have always been fascinated by analog cameras. Not sure what attracts me in them, but there is something magical in capturing moments without knowing exactly how they will be until the film is developed. Last year, while exploring a thrift store in the city center, I found an old camera, one of these with worn leather finish and were marks that told stories. It was cheap and still seemed functional, so I bought it. Along with it, the seller gave me a roll of film already loaded, saying that it was a gift. I didn't think much at the time, but the idea of developing a forgotten film made me excited. Days later, I took the film to a studio specialized in developing old photos. When I picked up, the attendant was with a strange expression. She said the roll appeared to have been used recently, but that the images were in perfect condition, as if they had been made by a professional. I was intrigued, and as soon as I got home, I started looking at the pictures. What I saw made me freeze. In all of them, I was present, but in places that I had never visited. Some images showed unknown streets, other interiors of houses that I never went, but in all I appeared, always in the center, as if it was the focus of the scene. I spent hours looking at the photos, trying to find some logical explanation. At first, I thought it might be someone who looked a lot like me, but the details were too precise. The clothes, my watch, even a small scar on my right arm that only I would know. Each photo seemed more impossible than the other. In one, I was sitting in a cafe looking out of the window. In another, I was in a forest, holding something that I could not identify. The strangest thing was that in all the photos, there was a certain blur in the background, as if the camera wanted to highlight only my presence. I decided to investigate the first photo, which showed a place that looked like a narrow alley with graffiti-covered walls. It looked familiar, but I couldn't remember where. After some internet searches, I found out that it was in a neighborhood of the city where I rarely went. I took courage and went there with the photos in hand. When I arrived, the place was identical to the photo, the same angle, the same light. What made me even more puzzled was to find, in the corner of the alley, something that seemed to have been left for me. It was an old book with a torn leather cover. Inside there was a dedication signed by someone I knew, my mother. Seeing my mother's name on that dedication made me shiver. She had been dead for almost 5 years, and I had never seen that book before. The written message said, "For you, who have always seen the world in a different way." I immediately recognized her handwriting, but what was that doing there, in a place where I've never been? I took the book home, trying to make sense of everything. I spent the whole night revisiting the photos, as if I was looking for another detail that would lead me to some answer. It was then that I noticed something new. One of the photos showed the interior of a living room. The environment looked old-fashioned, with dark wood furniture and a bookcase full of books. In the corner, there was a wall clock that marked exactly 3:15. But what caught my attention was something on the table. A picture with an old photo of me and my mother, taken when I was a child. I remembered that painting. It had disappeared during the move after his death. The room in the photo looked vaguely familiar, but I could not identify where it was from. I decided to look for it, even without knowing where to start. I spent the next few days trying to identify the place of the living room. I showed the photo to some close friends, but no one recognized it. It was then that, by chance, I found a clue, a detail that I had ignored before. In the upper corner of the image, there was a window, and through it it was possible to see part of a building facade with a sign. The word was blurry, but I managed to decipher pension. I did a quick search on the internet, and after filtering some results, I found an old pension with that name, located in a city about 2 hours from where I lived. I decided to go there the same day. When I arrived, the facade was exactly the same as in the photo. The place looked abandoned, with dirty windows and an old sign hanging. But contrary to what I expected, the door was unlocked. I entered carefully, and the smell of mold and old wood was suffocating. I walked through the dark corridors until I found the photo room. My heart has popped. It was exactly the same. The furniture, the bookcase, the wall clock marking 3h15, as if time in that place had stopped. In the center of the table, the picture with my mother and me was there. But there was something else, an old camera, just like the one I had bought at the thrift store. Seeing that camera on the table left me completely paralyzed. It was identical to the one I bought at the thrift store, with the same leather finish and even the scratches on the side. Took the camera carefully, as if it could be broken in my hands. There was a film roll inside. My heart popped, but at the same time a thought froze me. Who had taken the pictures that were in the original camera? I decided not to develop the film there. I kept the camera in my backpack, along with the picture of me and my mother. Before I left, I felt like I should look around once more. While I was searching the room, I noticed something that had been overlooked before. An envelope stuck on the back of the clock, opened carefully, and inside there was another photo. This time, the image was completely different. Showed the same room, but with a person present. It was a tall man in old clothes standing next to the picture. He seemed to be looking directly at the camera, as if he knew he was being photographed. His face looked familiar, but at the same time impossible to identify. It was as if he was there waiting for me. That image stuck in my mind as I left the boarding house. Who was that man? And why did it look so familiar? I decided that I needed to reveal the film on camera. I went straight to the same studio where I had taken the first roll. This time, I explained as little as possible not to seem crazy. Just asked them to reveal it urgently. As I waited, fear grew inside me. Part of me didn't want to know what was in that film, but another part was desperate for answers. A few hours later, the technician handed me the photos with a serious expression. The images were disturbing. Most showed places I had been, but at times that I did not remember. A photo in particular caught my attention. It showed my old house where I grew up with my mother. It was a picture of the yard, taken from an angle that only someone inside the property could have captured. In the corner of the photo, the same man from the picture of the boarding house was there again, standing watching me. The scariest detail was that he held something in his hand. The picture of my mother and me, the same one I had found at the boarding house. After seeing that picture, I felt my whole body freeze. How could that man be holding the painting before I even met him at the boarding house? And why did it seem to be following me, even in images of places I knew? I decided to go home, but the feeling of being watched accompanied me every step. I kept the photos and camera in a safe place, trying to think about the next step. It was then that I noticed something that had escaped before. On the back of one of the photos, there was a handwritten message. "Meet me where it all began." The phrase was enigmatic, but the meaning became clear to me almost immediately. Where it all started could only be my old house, where the photo of the backyard had been taken. I decided to go there on the same day. The house has been closed for years since my mother died, and it looked abandoned. When I arrived, the gate was rusty and the windows were covered with dust, but the structure was still exactly as I remembered. I entered carefully, feeling a strange weight in the air, as if the house was stuck in time. In the corner of the room, on a table covered with dust, there was something that made me stop immediately. Another photo, taken recently. This time I entered the house, exactly at that moment. That last photo was enough to make me run out of the room. I almost stumbled down the stairs, my heart pounding, but something made me stop in the room. The table where I had seen the painting before was now completely clean. There was no sign of dust, nor of the photos or objects that were there. The air seemed heavier, almost as if the house was alive, watching every movement of mine. It was then that I heard a noise coming from the yard, something scratching the ground, as if someone was walking slowly. With the lantern flickering in my hand, I went to the back door. When I opened it, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the yard in the faint moonlight. It was him, the man in the photos, tall, thin, with slightly curved posture, as if he was waiting for me. He did not move, but it was as if his presence was enough to keep me still. I tried to scream, but my voice didn't come out. It was then that I realized he was holding something. It was the camera I had found in the pension. Without saying a word, he just raised the camera as if preparing to take a picture, and I heard the click. The sound of the camera click took me out of the trance. Without thinking twice, I ran back into the house and locked the back door. My heart felt like it was coming out of my mouth, and I could barely breathe. I tried to convince myself that it was some kind of hallucination, but I knew it was real. When I turned to get my backpack and leave there for good, I saw something that made me stop again. In the corner of the room, on top of the clean table, was another photo. It was me with my back to the door that I had just locked. I took the picture with my hands shaking, and on the back there was a last message. "Now we are together." That was enough for me. I left everything behind and ran out of the house without looking back. I didn't care about the camera, the pictures, or anything else that might be there. Since that day, I have never went back to my childhood home. I don't know who or what that man was, but I still have the feeling he hasn't disappeared. Sometimes I find things out of place in my apartment, as if someone had passed by. And from time to time, when the silence of the night is absolute, I have the impression of hearing the sound of a camera clicking. The passengers who never leave. It all started like any other day of my routine. I took the same bus every morning to go to work, always at the same time. It was a quiet line, rarely full, and I got a place by the window almost always. But a few weeks ago I started to notice something strange. There was a group of people who were always there, in the same places, every day. I never paid much attention to them at first, but it was hard not to notice when they were always the same faces. A man in a gray suit, a woman with a red scarf and sunglasses, and an old lady who never looked at anyone. What made me uneasy was to realize that they never came down. No matter the point, they were there, standing firm, as if just waiting for something. I started to notice them more and realized that they also did not seem to interact with each other. They were motionless, almost without moving the whole time. One day, I tried to pay more attention to their faces and felt a shiver. The faces were strangely erased, as if some expression or emotion was missing. Even with the bus moving, it seemed that I was the only one noticing it. That's when I decided to try something different. I went down 2 dots before my usual destination to see if they would leave too. They didn't, and the next day, there they were again, in the same places. The repetition started to bother me more than I wanted to admit. I decided to test something else. I took the bus in the opposite direction, just to see if they would be there. And they were, exactly in the same seats, as if they had never left. When I entered, the man in the gray suit seemed to look at me, but his eyes were empty, without focus. My mind began to work on 1,000 possibilities. Would workers going somewhere fixed? A strange coincidence? Or something else? But I didn't have the courage to ask anything directly. I decided just to observe. That day, the annoyance turned to fear. When I got off the bus at my usual stop, I came back to look inside one last time. They were all looking directly at me. It wasn't something subtle like a casual look. It was direct, synchronized, as if they knew I was paying attention. I walked fast to work, trying to forget, but could not get those expressions out of my head. The most disturbing thing was that even looking at me, they still seemed empty. I can't explain. It was like animated mannequins, but the worst was yet to come. That night, as I was coming home, I decided to take the same bus. It was no longer the usual time, and I was convinced that it was just paranoia. The bus was almost empty, with only 2 or 3 passengers besides me. I relaxed for a few minutes, but when I looked back, my heart popped. They were there. The man in a gray suit, the woman with the red scarf and the elderly lady. In the same places, immobile. It was impossible that they were there again at that time. I tried to convince myself that it was a coincidence, but something inside me knew that it wasn't. Decided to face them. I got up and walked to where they were sitting. My plan was simple. Speak directly to the man in the gray suit. Ask him if he took that bus every day and try to get an explanation. But when I approached, something strange happened. He turned his face to me before I even said anything, as if he knew I was coming. And then I realized his face was completely different. It was him, but the lines seemed distorted as if they were blurred. Before I could react, I felt a sudden dizziness and everything went dark. I woke up in a completely different place. I was lying on something hard, with a strong smell of dust and mold all around me. When I opened my eyes, I realized that I was in an abandoned shed. The moonlight came through cracks in the ceiling boards, and silence was oppressive. I tried to get up, but my head was spinning and my ears were buzzing. I had no idea how I got there. The last thing I remembered was the blurry face of the man in the suit on the bus. My heart popped when I realized that I still held my backpack. I looked around looking for any sign of life, but everything was empty, or at least it seemed. I walked through the shed, trying to find a way out, and it was then that I noticed something on the floor. Footprints. They were not mine, because they seemed recent and were scattered everywhere, as if several people had passed by there. The feeling of being watched took hold of me. It was then that I heard a sound behind me, a low creaking, as if someone were moving. When I turned around, I saw a silhouette in the darkest corner of the shed. It was the man in the gray suit. He was standing watching me with that empty expression that seemed to be fixed in my brain. Before I could react, he stepped forward and whispered something I couldn't understand. It was enough to make me run. I ran without looking back, stumbling over boxes and lumber scattered on the floor of the shed. My only goal was to find a way out. At every step, I had the feeling that someone was following me, but did not dare to turn around to check. Finally, I found a heavy metal door and pushed it with all my strength. She opened with a loud creak, and I went out to what appeared to be an empty parking lot. The fresh night air hit me like a punch, but I didn't have time to breathe relieved. I looked around and realized that the shed was in the middle of nowhere. There were no buildings or busy streets, only darkness and some lights in the distance. My phone was in my pocket, but the battery had run out. I started walking towards the lights, hoping to find someone, but with each step, the silence seemed to get heavier. It was then that I saw something that left me paralyzed. The the bus. It was parked a few meters from where I was, with the lights on. The door was open, as if it were waiting for me. Against all instinct, I approached. When I looked inside, I felt my body freeze. They were there. The man in the gray suit, the woman with the red scarf, and the old lady sitting exactly as always. But this time there was something different. The last seat was empty, and it seemed reserved for me. I stood in the bus entrance, unable to move. The silence was so absolute that I could hear my own heart beating. I looked at the man in the gray suit, expecting some kind of reaction, but he remained still, with that empty face that seemed to get worse every time I saw him. The woman with the red scarf slightly turned her head towards me, as if she was inviting me in. It was then that I realized that all the other seats were covered by a thin layer of dust, except for the one that seemed reserved for me. It seemed to be used recently, as if someone had just left. Not knowing what to do, I started to back off, but before I could go away, the door of the bus closed itself and the internal lights went out. I ran in the opposite direction, without looking back, just trying to get as far away from it as possible. After a few minutes of running, I found a road and, luckily, a car that stopped to help me. The driver, an older man, asked what had happened, but I was so shocked that I could barely explain. He took me to the nearest town, and all I wanted was to go home and forget it. But the story didn't end there. The next morning, as I recounted the events of the previous night, I noticed something in my trouser pocket. It was a bus ticket, crooked, with the same number of the line I took daily. On the back, there was a handwritten message, "See you tomorrow." Since then, I never got on a bus, but sometimes when I pass through a terminal, I have the feeling that they are still there, waiting. The call that should never have been answered. This happened a little over a year ago, at a time when I was going through many changes. I had just moved into a small apartment after a difficult divorce and was trying to start over. My work was remote, so I spent most of the time alone. It was during one of those quiet nights that my landline phone rang for the first time. That would be strange in itself, because almost no one knew I had a landline. It was something that came with the apartment contract, and I never bothered to use it or pass the number on to anyone. Answered, thinking it could be some mistake, but on the other side of the line I heard a husky and distant voice. At first I thought it was an older person, someone who had trouble speaking, but as the voice continued, I realized something was wrong. She said my full name, paused, and began to say things that no one should know. Details about my childhood, about my mother who passed away years ago, and even about my divorce. I was paralyzed with a dry throat, trying to find the courage to ask who it was, but the call broke down before I said anything. It was as if someone knew exactly the right time to hang up. After that first call, I was restless. I tried to convince myself that it was just a joke. maybe someone with information found on the internet. But deep down, something seemed wrong. The next day, the landline rang again, exactly at 10 p.m. I answered hesitantly, and the same husky voice started talking. This time it wasn't just about my past. She started to mention things that happened recently. How I was wearing a blue sweater at the time, and what I had ordered in the lunch delivery. Every detail made my heart beat faster. "Do you remember what you did in that house?" asked the voice before the call fell off once again. That was the last straw. I unplugged my phone, thinking it would solve the problem. But the messages started on my cell phone. At first, it was simple, almost harmless texts. "Do you remember me? Are you still ignoring me?" Then they started to get more personal. Messages like, "Do you still keep your diary in the bedroom closet?" Or, "How does it feel to sleep alone?" made me completely scared. What scared me most was that the number where the messages came from was always the same as the landline phone I had disconnected. I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I called the operator and asked them to take the number out. I explained the situation, but as expected, the attendant was skeptical and said that she would do everything possible to investigate. After a few days, I received a call from the operator. The number I had reported was registered as belonging to a line that had been disabled for more than 15 years. When I asked for more details, she mentioned an address linked to the account. The house where I grew up, the same one my family sold after my mother passed away. It gave me a chill in my spine. How could the number be calling me if the line even existed more? I tried to resist the idea, but I knew I had to go home. I drove there on the same day, my heart heavy and mind full of questions. The house was abandoned, the garden grown, and the windows covered with dust. When I touched the handle, it was unlocked, as if waiting for me. I entered carefully, each step echoing in the silence of the place. Everything looked exactly as I remembered, except for one thing. The landline in the room, the same old device my mother used, was there. And he started playing the moment I got in. I was paralyzed, hearing that high-pitched and insistent sound. It was impossible. The phone was there, but it should not be connected to anything. I took a few hesitant steps to him, every part of my body begging me to run away. When I finally reached the device, the touch stopped. I picked up the phone, hoping to find a loose wire or some logical explanation, but it was disconnected from the wall. There was no way that was working. It was then that I noticed something even more disturbing. The cover of the caller ID blinked, as if it had recorded the last call. The number that appeared was my own. Suddenly the room seemed colder, as if something was involving me. I put the phone back and started exploring the rest of the house. Upstairs, I went into my old room and went straight to the closet. It was empty except for a cardboard box in the corner, covered with dust. Carefully opened and found old objects, photos, toys, and in the background a diary, the same as the message mentioned. When I flipped through the pages, I realized it wasn't mine. It was my mother's diary, but the last pages were filled with repetitive phrases, as if they had been written by force. The clearest message was, "She will hear me, even if it is the last thing I do." That phrase echoed in my mind. She will hear me, even if it is the last thing I do. The letters seemed to have been written in anger, deeply marking the paper. I didn't understand what my mother meant by that, but at the same time a part of me knew it had to do with the calls. As I leafed through the diary, I noticed that the previous pages were full of disturbing reports. My mother mentioned hearing voices on the phone, loose words that seemed to be directed at her. In one of the entries she wrote, "It's not my fault. I can't change what happened." I went back to the room, taking the diary with me, but the house now looked different. It was as if every noise was amplified, and the sound of a non-existent wind circulated through the rooms. Then the phone rang again. My body jammed, but I knew I had to answer. When I put the hearing aid in my ear, I heard the same hoarse voice as before. This time she said something different. "Finally, we are in the same house." The sound was so low and disturbing that I felt my skin shiver. Before I could say anything, the connection broke down, but this time it was not only the silence that remained. A strong smell of burning began to spread through the environment. The burning smell got stronger every second, and I started looking for the source. That's when I realized it was coming from the phone. The base of it was hot to the touch, and a thin smoke slowly rose. I tried to push it away, but when I touched it, I felt a shock, as if it was connected to something living. I dropped the phone on the floor, and the sound of the impact echoed through the empty room. Before I could react, the ambient light began to flash, and a distant sound of steps seemed to come from the corridor leading upstairs. My heart popped, and the only thing I thought was to run away. But before I could move, something on the ground caught my attention. Beside the phone where he had fallen were pieces of paper burned, as if they had come out of the device. Picked up one of them carefully, and I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was my mother's. The message was short but clear. "Go back to your room." It didn't make sense. Who or what was trying to guide me? Against all my instinct, I went up the stairs again, feeling every step creak under my feet. When I got to the room, I realized that the diary was no longer where I had left it. In his place, the telephone was fixed, intact, as if it had never fallen. Seeing the phone in place of the diary was like a punch in the stomach. It was impossible. I had left that device in the room, broken and releasing smoke. My first instinct was to leave there, but something made me stay, as if the house itself was holding me. The phone started ringing again. The sound sounded louder, more urgent. I approached slowly with trembling hands and answered. Before I could say anything, the voice started to speak, but this time it was no longer hoarse. It was my mother's voice. "You need to remember," she said. The phrase sounded like an echo, repeated several times, louder and louder. I tried to ask her what she wanted to say, but my voice wouldn't come out. The connection was abruptly cut off, and the room was in absolute silence. It was then that I realized something I had not noticed before. In the mirror of the closet, there was a message written with something that looked like steam or oil. In the basement, I did not hesitate. I ran down the stairs and went straight to the locked basement door. I used all my strength to push her, and she finally gave in. What I found down there made me freeze. The basement was almost completely dark, with only the dim light of a lamp hanging in the center. The smell of mold and something stronger, maybe rust, took over the place. In the far corner, there was a wooden chair facing the wall, and something told me I needed to look closer. Every step I took was accompanied by a creaky creak from the floor, and my heart seemed to be beating so loud that it echoed through the environment. When I got closer, I realized that there was something on top of the chair, my mother's diary again. It was open, but this time on a page I had not seen before. The message was short, but clear. "You let it happen." On the floor, next to the chair, there were old photos, many of them faded. When I picked them up, I recognized immediately. They were from me and my mother, but there were also images of another woman. The last photo of the pile was different. It showed my mother holding a baby in a room that looked like the house. The expression on her face was of despair, and behind her, almost imperceptible, was the same wooden chair. Only then I realized that something was wrong. I felt a movement behind me, and when I turned, the chair was empty but slowly rocking as if someone had just left it. The sight of the rocking chair made me freeze. Every part of my body was screaming for me to get out, but something was pinning me to the ground. It was then that I heard a low sound, almost a whisper, coming from the darkest corner of the basement. At first, I could not understand what it was, but soon realized that it was someone crying. That cry seemed so familiar that it was impossible to ignore. Took the diary with my hands shaking and held it steady as I tried to illuminate the corner with the dim light of my phone. Nothing, but the sound continued, now closer, as if it was circulating around me. When I turned my attention to the diary, a page that was previously blank now had a new message written with trembling letters. I warned. "You didn't want to hear." At that moment, the crying stopped, and the basement plunged into an even more terrifying silence. It was then that I noticed a shadow next to me, projected on the wall by the reflection of light. The shadow was not mine. It was a tall, immobile figure, and although I could not see the face, there was something about it that looked familiar. Before he could react, the phone rang again, this time louder and insistent, echoing through the basement. The ringing of the phone echoed through the basement. Each sound seemed louder and closer than the previous one. I looked around, but could not see where the sound was coming from. There was no way that there was a phone there. My heart popped, and the only thing I could do was to follow the sound. It seemed to come from a dark corner of the basement where you could hardly see. When I approached, I saw the landline phone in the room, the same one that had already rung so many times that night. It was on the ground, dusty but intact. Took the device with shaking hands, and before even answering, the sound stopped. But the silence lasted a short time. On the display, a message began to flash. "Listen." I answered, even without knowing why. The same voice came back, but this time it was not a whisper or something distant. It was clear, and without a shadow of doubt, it was my mother's voice. "You forgot. You were the one who let it happen," she said, with a rage I never associated with her memory. I tried to warn her, but now it's too late. Before I could ask what she was talking about, the line became silent, and the environment around me seemed colder. When I turned, the shadow that was motionless on the wall now seemed to move. It was in front of me. The shadow in front of me was not just an indistinct figure. It seemed to take shape, as if it were materializing in the cold air of the basement. My instinct was to run, but my legs did not obey. All I could do was hold the phone and the diary as if they were going to protect me. The figure leaned slowly towards me, and for the first time I could see a face. It was my mother, or at least something that looked like her but distorted, like a version of her that carried all the pain and anger I never knew existed. "You left me alone," she said, but the voice seemed to come from all sides, not just the figure. "You forgot what you promised, and now it's your turn to stay." The last sentence was said with an intensity that made my ears ache. Before I could react, I felt something pull me back, as if the ground itself was giving way. I fell to the floor of the basement, but when I looked around, I was again in the living room. The phone was back on the table, intact, and the diary was no longer in my hands. Everything looked like when I had arrived, except for one detail. The chair in the corner of the room was now occupied. She was there, motionless, looking directly at me. I was paralyzed, staring at the chair. My mother was sitting there, or at least what was left of it. It was not a physical body, but a presence that filled the environment in an almost suffocating way. His eyes, once so familiar, were now empty, fixed on me, as if they expected something. I tried to speak, but my voice did not come out. Then suddenly, she slowly raised her arm and pointed to the phone on the table. He started playing again, loud and insistent, but this time I knew I couldn't answer. The feeling was that if I answered, something definitive would happen, something I could never escape. Without thinking twice, I ran out of the house, leaving everything behind. The phone still rang, the sound echoing even when I was already outside. I got in the car and drove as fast as I could. I never went back to that house, and since that day, every phone that rings makes me shiver. Sometimes I have the feeling that I can still hear that ring, even when I'm alone and there is no phone nearby. I don't know what my mother wanted to show me or what she thought I'd forgotten, but one thing is certain: that house still holds something, and I don't have the courage to figure it out.